Hey everyone, I hope you are doing well. I just noticed that spaces now have this music feature, which is cool, I guess. And I'm perhaps the discussion will be so terrible that you'll beg me to just play music after a while. We'll see. Um, okay, and I see that Xbox Live is here. Just a couple of things in terms of housekeeping. So, if you want to hear more conversations like this, you can subscribe to the Substack. We just had a really great conversation last night with JF about artificial intelligence, and there was actually a lot of crossover in what we're going to talk about tonight. Um, also, by way of housekeeping, this when I put up this title for the space, "Does God exist?" I did get a little bit of a feeling of cringe. Let's say, like we're going back to 2005 era atheism versus theism debates and all that kind of stuff. I think everyone's moved past that. That's not really my intention. Although we might tread on that ground a little bit. But my intention is to have a interesting, thoughtful discussion about these matters, and not really to get into a Hitchens versus Dinesh D'Souza debate. I guess I would be playing the role of Hitchens, and Xbox is stuck with the D'Souza. You're welcome.
You'd be the real racist, Richard.
True.
Dan's the real racist.
Once again. So Xbox Live, how are you?
I'm well. Sorry, I just dropped my phone. I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
Good.
How have you been? It's been a minute since we spoke.
Definitely. Yes, I am doing well. There's snow on the ground, and skiing is now possible. And yes.
Oh, you're out whitefish?
Yes, definitely. It's been a
Very
bit
nice.
dry recently, but it is a good snow year. I'm waiting for a big dump. Perhaps I could, I don't know, do some kind of sacrifice for the Schnee gods. They could rain down on us. Okay, so let's talk about this issue. So, what sparked this space was a something that I had noticed, and you had actually mentioned it on Twitter about there was a video posted of one of these ortho bros who was wearing an Hawaiian shirt and actually just imitating Jay Dyer, almost not even paraphrasing, mimicking some of these Jay Dyer arguments. And I guess my question was like, surely there are better arguments than this, and I think you probably agreed with that as well. Now, the argument that he was making for God's existence is what I believe is categorized as the transcendental argument. And what he was saying, and what Jay Dyer said when he was debating one of these atheists as well, was that because you have a metaphysical worldview to some extent, whether you recognize it or not, you have notions of a soul and a self, and even you could even go to these kind of basic notions of space and time and so on. And because you use these every day, and because you would agree that we couldn't really communicate without notions of a person, you're not just flesh and bone. You're not just a sack of chemicals, or however some horrible ways that Neil deGrasse Tyson described humans. We don't actually operate like that. We operate on the basis of a real self. We obviously can't function in the world without a concept of time, not just your watch, but a bigger concept of time and a concept of space, etc. And thus, we are metaphysical, whether we like it or not, or whether we're aware of it or not, and thus you must kind of go the full Monty, as it were. You must therefore adopt a metaphysical notion of a creator God. So, am I representing that argument fairly?
I think that's Dyer's position. Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Um,
So, I guess there's almost like a simple way of dismissing it, which is much like Berkeley, like kicking a stone and saying, "Look, reality is real." Which is that, I mean, first off, none of those things necessarily imply the God of the Bible. So you could, even if you agree that there's some kind of abstract creator God out there, that doesn't mean that you necessarily believe in Yahweh of the Old Testament or Theos of the New Testament, etc. Those are, particularly with Yahweh, those are real characters. Yahweh walks through the Garden of Eden. He's a real thing. Yahweh has a personality, even. And he's a jealous God, among other things. He's terrifying in some ways. You can't quite look on him, but he does have representations that you can perceive him through. But you could, even if you agree that this somehow implies an abstract deity that created the universe, none of that, there's no reason to therefore be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim on that basis. I guess the other counter to that would be kind of like, who cares though? I mean, just because we use this language, we use it as a kind of placeholder or utilitarian thing that we just use. This is how you get on in the world. And, that notion of like, you must be entirely metaphysical consistent is just not particularly persuasive. So what do you think? I mean, do you think there's almost a stronger version of this? I mean, one that you would adhere to some degree, because you are a Christian, or do you think that this whole argument, this style of argumentation, is rather flimsy?
yes, I'm not sure if I would call the sort of arguments that I would defend transcendental arguments in the same way that Dyer intends. So, a transcendental argument, for just like people in the audience, the traditional way that that's been understood from Kant onward is that a transcendental argument establishes that X is a condition for the possibility of Y. Y is actual and therefore possible. Therefore, X. So somebody is on top of a mountain. In order to climb that mountain, they would have needed to use equipment. Therefore, they had to use equipment. That's kind of an analogy to demonstrate the basic principle of a transcendental argument.
Sure.
So I think Dyer's trying to say something like, I don't know, like I guess basic constitutive features of reality presupposes a condition for their possibility, a creator God. Now, I don't think that argument is in itself ridiculous. I just think that Dyer doesn't fill in many of the details. Like, why do they presuppose the existence of a God, let alone the God of the Bible?
Right.
And I think Dyer is basically like, well, there's just kind of various competing worldviews, and Orthodox Christianity, because he's Eastern Orthodox, it can make sense of why these features of reality exist. So it's reasonable to adopt that worldview. Now, you might say it's reasonable in a probabilistic sense, but it's not a very good argument to like demonstrate this position. It can maybe motivate it. It can maybe say like Orthodox Christianity kind of makes sense.
Right.
Whereas I think that it's possible to give stronger natural theological arguments to demonstrate with certainty that God exists. Now, I don't think they'll necessarily get you to the God of the Bible. However, I do think there's a problem with a lot of contemporary Christian apologetics where they say there's a sphere of natural theology where we have our reason unaided by revelation, and we establish the existence basically of like a Jeffersonian deist God.
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of tack onto that at the end, probabilistically, like, if you look at early church testimony, it's probable that Christ rose from the dead, and miracles testify to the probability of revelation. And I think that's a bad and also a very modern way of looking at the relationship between philosophy and religion. I think there are stronger arguments that can philosophically motivate the God of revelation, but they're not going to demonstrate the existence of the God of revelation. So that's kind of how I would divide up the labor between these two positions.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I can kind of get into providing.
Before you do that, real quick. So, is there something unique about Orthodoxy that differentiates it from, say, Catholicism or Protestantism that Dyer is pointing to? Like, I look, I'll be, from the standpoint of most people who will listen to this, they just think of Orthodoxy, oh, it's Russian or Byzantium or something like that, but it's all Christianity. Now, obviously, there was the greatest of all schisms between. Oh my gosh, it was whether the Holy Spirit flows from the Father or the Son, and the Son.
Yeah,
brush me up on that, and maybe also answer the question of, like, is there something unique about Orthodoxy that Dyer is pointing to?
Yeah. So, without looking it up, I think it's like, was it 1058, the Great Schism? Anyway, mid 11th century is the period that's usually dated for the so-called Great Schism. Although obviously Latin and Byzantine Christianity had a multi-century falling out prior to that point over mostly actually political disputes. There's the Byzantine Empire and then kind of Germanic kingdoms that were successor states to the Roman Empire in the West, and kind of struggle for legitimacy. But there were a number of theological disputes, for example, whether or not unleavened bread should be used in communion, whether monks, stuff like that. But the one that's kind of most central or most famous is the filioque. So the filioque in Latin meaning "and from the Son" or "and through the Son." It's clarifying the way in which the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, proceeds from the Father. The Orthodox, from the original Nicene Creed, say that the Father and the Son, the Son and the Spirit both proceed from the Father. The Catholics, the Latin Catholics, will say the Son proceeds from the Father and the Spirit proceeds from the Father by way of the Son or through the Son. Now that has a lot of, that sounds like really autistic, which kind of is, but it has to do with Arianism and a lot of the early church heresies that were the Christological heresies. And
Protestants don't disagree with Catholics on that notion. So that's correct, sir?
Yeah, so during the Protestant Reformation, I think there were maybe some Anabaptists or radical reformers who removed the filioque from their creeds. But basically all mainstream Protestants in the West, because they come from the Latin Catholic line, they accept the filioque. As long as they're Trinitarians. I mean, there's very liberal Protestants who just reject the Trinity. Yeah.
Who rejects the? So I don't want to get too diverged here, but there are some liberal Protestants who reject the Trinity.
Yeah. So for one, Unitarians. So Thomas.
Okay.
So Unitarians reject the Trinity. There are some modern charismatic Protestants. What do they call themselves? Is it One Jesus Christianity or something? I don't know a lot about this, but there are some recent late 20th, early 21st century charismatic movements that also reject the Trinity. But I'm mostly thinking about Unitarianism.
And that was actually very important in the history of Massachusetts. Wasn't that effectively a state church? Or was that the Unitarian church?
I think Congregationalists were the state.
Congregation. Okay.
But Unitarianism was very prominent in the Northeast and ended up, I think, taking over Harvard Divinity School at some point. So a lot of kind of American elite, liberal Protestant, WASP, New England culture was profoundly shaped by Unitarianism.
Okay, good. I'm glad you're answering these questions because as you can tell, I want to learn a little more. This is not quite my forte, so that's very helpful. But okay, but so I guess your answer is you're not sure whether Dyer and people like him are claiming something unique about Orthodoxy.
Oh no, the follow-up as far as Orthodoxy is concerned. So Dyer has criticized natural theology. So for people in the audience, natural theology is the attempt from reason unaided by revelation, metaphysics,
Right.
to demonstrate the existence of God or to demonstrate certain things about the divine. And Dyer has claimed that natural theology is basically like a Western heresy, like a Latin heresy that's been imported from kind of like Neoplatonic elements of Latin Christianity, Latin Catholicism. So he thinks, and this is, I don't think, I mean, I can't get into a debate with Dyer about this because I'm not Eastern Orthodox. I don't have the relevant knowledge. But I think my hunch is that this is an ahistorical view. My understanding from other Eastern Orthodox scholars who are historians is that prior to the early modern period, there's really not a lot of difference between Eastern and Western Christians dealing with Greek sources. They definitely embrace natural theology. Early church fathers like St. John Damascene give natural theological arguments to the existence of God, philosophical arguments to the existence of God. But then in the 19th, like late 19th, early 20th century, the Russian Slavophile movement, ultra conservative monarchist, czarist Russians, they start to reject natural theology as a kind of like rationalist corruption that was introduced by scholasticism, and they think it culminates in like the French Revolution and liberalism. So there's a tendency in very conservative sects of Orthodoxy to see natural theology as a kind of rationalist corruption of Christianity. So I think Dyer's operating kind of in that tendency. So one of the big people in this tradition is like Vladimir Lossky. It's like an early 20th century Orthodox theologian. But I don't think that that's like, I think that that's common in contemporary Orthodoxy. I'm skeptical about whether or not that's a historical position of like pre-modern Eastern Orthodoxy.
Right. Well, there is something to the notion of Enlightenment thinkers, Locke, Hume, and company, be not some of whom might have been closeted atheists or something like that, but they're reaching a rational justification of God and almost a rational God as well, and they're kind of getting the camel's nose, or what is that, camel's toe or nose under the tent or something. They're kind of unleashing a force where you can arrive at the truth not through revelation and thus through the church and authorities, and you can kind of arrive at it through reason. And there is a kind of radical quality to that. I can almost see the argument on the side of these ultra conservatives.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the best example of this, or one of the best examples of this, might be Kant. Kant wrote Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, his famous work on religion. I mean, all of Kant's critiques are on religion in
Right.
the end. His most famous work, Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, it's just what it says on the can, just what it says on the tin. It's trying to establish a rational religion that can be, it's kind of the core of for him, moral religion, to which kind of positive religion can then be like attached as a cultural appendage, basically. That is competing interpretations about how does this relate to actual historical religion in Kant's view. But I think what's interesting about Kant, and also this is definitely the case for Hume, is that because of Kant's underlying metaphysical skepticism, because of transcendental idealism, kind of keeping us bound within the phenomenal realm, he cuts off the possibility of speculation about God's nature and God's inner life. So Kant's moral religion is all about kind of what people say the economic trinity. What does God do in salvation history for human beings? How does God appear to us, for example, in moral conscience? But God's inner life, like what God is in himself prior to our need for him in morality, is kind of thrown out. So Kant says, for example, that the Trinity is a doctrine which has no relevance for rational religion. And that becomes a big deal in 19th century liberal Protestantism, which is very much concerned with religion as essentially a moral doctrine, or Christianity is a moral doctrine, which I think in a certain way, actually pre-modern scholastic views of Christianity are, I don't want to say they're more rationalist, because that is a kind of technical meaning, but they're more speculative. They think that reason can tell a lot about, or reason or rational intuition or mystical experience, which is rational, can give you a lot of knowledge about God's inner life. So I think that in some ways, modern Christianity, 19th century Christianity, is more rationalist. It's more skeptical about revelation. But in some ways, it's more anti-rationalist because it cuts off speculation about God's inner life. It's more
Right.
anthropocentric. It's about the role of religion in human kind of social and moral life.
Right. I think Kant makes a very interesting move because, you can't know a thing in itself. You can't fully know the world outside of your head. And thus, you can't prove God's existence through an act, even. I mean, Jesus could come down and divide loaves of bread. And from a kind of Kantian perspective, you couldn't fully know that. You could only understand the way that your mind is engaging in sensory perception. And so God for Kant becomes a kind of fulfillment of a rational morality. I mean, do you disagree with that kind of?
Oh,
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I have a. I'm not disagreeing with you. I have probably one of the more conservative, like religious interpretations of Kant. Like I think Kant is like a proto-liberal Protestant. I think he's a Lutheran, and God's very
Definitely.
important for him. Which was kind of like the Anglo-American consensus. It's like, oh, he's an agnostic kind of proto 21st century Rawlsian liberal, which is
Yeah.
false. But I think that you're totally right. Kant in the first critique, in the Transcendental Dialectic, he cuts off the possibility of a theoretical demonstration of the existence of God. For basically, I mean, it's complicated, the individual arguments, but basically the reason that you said, he's like, well, we only have knowledge of sensible reality, which the mind structures for us. Basically, the principle is, the mind can only know that which it creates,
Right.
or it forms, and that's phenomenal, sensible reality for Kant. Obviously, if you're not a transcendental idealist, this isn't as much of a problem. But for Kant, we can only know sensible reality. So, have fun trying to, make the leap from the sensible to the noumenal realm, from the sensible to the supersensible. Kant also says, for much the same reasons, even if there is a God, and even if that God were to reveal himself to us and provide us with special revelation, we would have no means of recognizing, of ascertaining whether that revelation really comes from God or not.
Right.
Because we would have to already antecedently know that this is God revealing himself to us. So obviously, theologians have criticized this a lot, but that becomes a kind of dominant view in early 19th century Western, especially German, intellectual culture. Now, Kant gets overtaken by Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, who have much more speculative theologies and much more positive views of revelation, but then he makes a comeback in the late 19th century. I think that kind of the dominant tendencies in Western, even Anglo-American intellectual, philosophical life have taken over that aspect of Kant's thought, his kind of metaphysical agnosticism. Now, Kant does, through his moral philosophy, he does bring in the role of religion because he thinks, so what we do have certainty of beyond the sensible world is our own moral conscience. We can know the moral law and its requirements.
Right.
And the moral law is a kind of super sensible ideal that for Kant will require positing a God as a condition for its realization. But that's, he says, only a regulative idea. Like we have to have faith that God exists, but we can't demonstrate it as a matter of certainty for Kant.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think that's an expansion of what I was saying. So I'm glad we're on the same page on that. A kind of fulfillment of your own reasoned morality, that a God exists to that degree. It's always struck me as fascinating. I think I might have joked about this with you before, of the Catholic Church did put an edict, or they banned, in fact, they canceled Kant.
They put the first critique on the index, yeah.
Yes. Even though he, was a kind of person who you could surmise was rationally justifying. I mean, you could sum up Kant saying that he was rationally justifying Jesus's message of be good to one another, in this, amazingly complex philosophical book. But perhaps the church was right from their standpoint. They kind of understood what he was pushing forward, and what this kind of thinking could lead to, because it didn't, in a way, need them. anymore. Just a thought. They
No,
didn't ban Nietzsche, and my theory about that was A, it was 100 years later, but B, Nietzsche was a kind of heavy metal album that almost justified the church. Like it's that bad death metal that makes good people want to go to Sunday school. That a bit of a joke, but you get my point.
no, I agree. I actually think that Kant is much more dangerous to if you're a committed Christian. I think Kant can be much more dangerous than Nietzsche in some ways.
Yeah.
Nietzsche might be morally shocking. I think Kant, I work primarily on Kant. I in some ways sympathize with Kant, but I think Kant, in a very insidious way, will kind of unravel what's metaphysically distinctive and appealing about Christianity. I would say that Kant is justifying, if anything, Kant is a belated justification of Lutheranism and of Martin Luther, which is that's how Heidegger interpreted him. That's how Ernst Cassirer, who's a contemporary of Martin Heidegger's, interpreted him. Said Kant is kind of, I think the most famous, Richard Kroner, who's an early 20th century philosopher. He said Kant is the Protestant Aquinas. Or no, sorry, he said Hegel is the Protestant Aquinas. It's not Paul Natorp. Forgetting the name. It's an early 20th century Lutheran theologian. So Kant is the philosopher of Protestantism.
Right.
So I think that Kant, he definitely justifies Protestantism. Many Catholic critics of Kant think that he's an atheist, he's agnostic. He justifies Protestantism, but there's not much room, for example, for the sacraments in Kant. There's not much of a role for the church anymore. There's not much role for the Trinity, for kind of mysticism. It's a very kind of disenchanted view of Christianity, a Christianity that's subservient to modernity, basically.
Right.
Whereas Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche, even if he should be justly criticized from a Catholic point of view, and he's mostly criticizing Pietism or Lutheranism, I think that Nietzsche understood Christianity in its kind of mystical core in a way that Kant didn't. Sometimes I recommend for people who are atheists, who are interested in Catholicism, as an introductory work, I recommend Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, because I think that book reflects an understanding of Hellenistic religion or pre-Hellenistic religion, pre-Socratic religion, in a way that kind of sets the stage for the basic problems that set up Christianity as like an intellectually appealing system. In a way like modern Christian apologetics, which are 2,000 years removed from Middle Platonism, and don't give you the proper context. Someone like William Lane Craig, for example, I think they don't. They misconstrue it.
Right.
And they give you that kind of two-step, like, oh, you have natural theology that proves deism, and then you have this kind of like archaeological science investigating whether or not the resurrection took place. Like, well, that's totally a red herring, misleading diversion. So
I agree, and I'm a little bit surprised that you would say that, but yes, that is my impression as well. Let's talk about something related to the transcendental argument that I mentioned earlier, but a cosmological argument, which is in effect there must be a uncaused cause at the beginning of the universe. The notion that the universe is eternal without beginning and end doesn't make sense, in the sense that, as we know from calculus, you can approach infinity. If you want to continuously divide something in half, you could, theoretically do that until the cows come home, until kingdom come. But the notion of a real infinity in the existing world does not make sense. You ultimately can't have more money than God, infinite amount of money, or something like that. It's so you can approach it, but not actualize it, and thus the universe could not exist eternally. That's a incoherent concept, and thus there must be some kind of beginning to this. And Craig will point to things like the Big Bang and other things like that, of like, look, see, we found empirical evidence for what we philosophically understood many centuries before. And so because the because space-time exists, there must be a beginning to it, and that beginning must be an unmoved mover, in effect. And that unmoved mover is the God of the Bible. Now, that is a bit of a leap, but at the very least, there is a kind of, deistic or Platonic God at the heart of things. So, in a way, everyone who seriously confronted this matter is ultimately a believer. I mean, Christians have the right faith, but even Plato, in effect, believed in God because he understood this thought process. Do you have anything to add to that, or that kind of cosmological view?
Sure. So, as a Thomist, basically my arguments for the existence of God are mostly cosmological in nature.
Mm-hmm.
But the one criticism I would point out, and it's not a criticism, I don't think you mischaracterize anything. It's that when we talk about the cosmological argument, there's a lot of different versions of the cosmological argument, different types of causal arguments, the existence of God. And the common one that you're pointing out that's very popular today with someone like William Lane Craig is commonly called the Kalam cosmological argument. So called because
Yes.
Kalam is, basically medieval Sunni Muslim scholasticism. It comes from Al-Ghazali. And that argument was very popular in kind of late medieval Islam. And some Christians, some Catholics, like St. Bonaventure, have advocated views kind of like this. Interestingly, though, Aquinas doesn't. Aquinas says that it's possible from the perspective of natural theology that the world might have existed eternally. It's possible that Aristotle was right and that an eternal world is necessary, but he still maintains a cosmological argument, which is interesting. I think it shows that the way Aquinas is thinking about the sort of causal relations that God is necessary to explain is not temporal. It's about metaphysical dependence and contingency, what's primary and derivative, rather than antecedent in a temporal causal way. So I think, I have a way I was thinking of kind of like reframing the debate that I think makes the question of the existence of God kind of interesting, and places Aquinas in very direct conversation with Plato, which I think that the question of the existence of God is really identical to the ancient problem going back to Plato or Parmenides of the one and the many. On the one hand, we confront a diversity, a plurality of many different things, and that's the manifold of experience. But these many things are intelligible only if they're reduced to some unity that explains them. So I see 5 red apples. They're intelligible to me. I can know them only through some universal like red that captures their unity. And I think that the question of the existence of God is ultimately
and Plato. I mean, the notion that the couch sitting right before me kind of participates in an eternal couchness, you could say, and that's how we understand it.
Right. I think that the basic view, whether or not you want to say eternity, is that there's some form which explains what things have in common. That form is in some sense prior to the things that participate in it. And there's different ways. I think that you get radically different theologies depending on how you think forms are participated in. So if you think that there's kind of if you're a Platonist, for example, and you think that there's this realm of just independent and distinct eternal forms that things are somehow crafted into, well, then you get a view where there's God, the good, that kind of calls things into being, and then there's a demiurge that kind of collects these forms as kind of archetypes, and then that demiurge is like an architect that puts them into the matter. Whereas if you have a Christian view, which is a little bit different, God is the unity of all of these forms, and the world is kind of constantly imitating his perfection. So as the prime mover, he's kind of calling the world into being, and then also he's acting as its final cause to kind of like inspire things to be formed in imitation of the divine goodness. Or you could have a different view where the world is kind of imminently forming itself. If you're like a pantheist or something. But whatever theology you have, I think is ultimately going to have to explain how the manifold of many distinct things in the world come to be intelligible. So I think intelligibility, and this is kind of in a certain way, this is a transcendental argument. It's explaining the possibility of knowledge. The
Hmm.
possibility of knowledge requires that things apart from our own conceptual scheme, things in the world really do have a kind of structure or affinity that makes it possible to know them.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the fundamental problem of philosophy, but also that's the problem that kind of ultimately culminates in theology. And the reason I think why it culminates in theology is that there's a kind of unity of unities, something that explains how all things in the world together constitute one unity, which is being. Um, Explains, for example, like how all things are a kind of harmonious system, how the various forms cohere with one another, how they're all knowable, how they exist, how they present themselves to us at all, not as some particular kind of thing, but just as being, how they can be good or desirable. That kind of fundamental transcendental unity is being itself. And I think that is essentially, controversial take, I think, the God of the Bible. Um,
Hmm.
because in Exodus 3:14, when God appears to Moses, he says, Aye asher aye. My Hebrew is shit, so I don't know if that's accurate pronunciation, but he says, I am that I am, which has traditionally been interpreted, for example, by Aquinas as God saying, what I am, my essence, is my being, my act of existence. Um, so I think that way of construing the problem makes the question of the existence of God more interesting. Because someone like William Lane Craig, or a lot of modern Christian apologists, they basically say, well, and we have this catalog of all the things that exist. There's tables and chairs and dogs and cats and human beings and whatever. And there's just one more thing that exists, God, that has special powers. He's like Superman or something.
Hmm.
And that might subtly change the way you view the world, because God has power to threaten you with hell if you don't do what he says, for example. Um, that's kind of a caricature of Craig's view. Obviously, it's a little bit unsympathetic, but that kind of view of God as one among the many things that exist. Whereas I think this way of looking at the problem, which looks more at, Christianity as emerging from the Platonic tradition, which it did, Middle Platonism, sees the question of the existence of God not as the question of the existence of just one more being, but as a way of framing how being itself is. It's a kind of, to kind of defend Dyer a little bit, it's a question of frameworks, right? A question of framing the constitution of reality as a whole. What does it mean to be? Well, to be, on the Christian view, I think, is to be thought of by God. Because Christians take over this Aristotelian definition. Aristotle defines God in, I think it's Metaphysics 12. It says God is the act of thought thinking itself.
Hmm.
God is an absolute mind contemplating himself, him being the fullness of being itself, an absolute being and all of the forms. And then in contemplating himself, he calls the world into being and kind of gives it intelligibility and purpose. And for one thing, I think that's a lot more defensible than this kind of scientific view that, like, oh, with a magnifying glass, we're searching for evidence for God. And on the other hand, it's a lot
Yes.
more interesting. Like, it makes sense, for example, of why, from a Nietzschean perspective, the death of God is such a moral and cultural catastrophe. It's not just that, like, people don't fear hell anymore, so they're going to be degenerate. It's like the structure that made this moral culture intelligible and gave it kind of direction, function, and a sense of, like, the knowability of things, the kind of permanence of the structures of nature, that's fallen away if you can't make sense or you can't believe in this metaphysical scheme. The world
Yes,
just becomes
we've
kind
been
of
we've been
pure flux.
untethered from the sun was the metaphor. And again, Nietzsche never says that, as you know, the God is dead. He always puts that into other people's mouths, which is pretty interesting. He puts it in the mouth. Not it doesn't necessarily imply that he didn't believe it, but he puts that in the mouth of a madman. Of we've been untethered from the sun and maybe all suns. Where are we going now? And the irony of the death of God in Nietzsche is that all the people around him already know that God is dead. so Zarathustra has a line about a hermit who I think is a placeholder for a Christian monk or of some kind. And Zarathustra laments, he's like, wow, this guy doesn't even know that God is dead. So it's kind of already been accepted. So it's even a greater catastrophe that Nietzsche's confronting, in the sense that we're kind of living on, going about our business, even though we've lost a real connection to the transcendent. And so it's a very powerful statement. I think one that is resonant to contemporary times, certainly.
It's also why so many of these, even kind of like tradcath Christian revival movements, are so LARPy, right? Because you're trying to recover. I mean, I'm not saying you can't be a sincere Christian today. I hope I'm a sincere Christian, but it takes a lot of intellectual effort to reacquire, to recover this classical metaphysical framework that previous people, without even knowing it kind of consciously or explicitly, they would have just kind of intuitively accepted. Like, of course, the world is ordered in a certain way. Of course, all things are kind of called into being by God and are constantly imitating God. Whereas like now, someone like William Lane Craig, for example, or many of his kind of followers, they'll accept a basically modern scientific worldview, a kind of like post-Newtonian view of physics, for example. But they just kind of tack on these like interesting, strange myth about like a Near Eastern superhero, basically. And like, well, it's not, someone like Plato is a lot closer to Christianity in its authentic historical context than like a modern, like Southern Baptist Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why, like, that's why to a large extent, like, even Christians don't realize that they don't really believe in God in the intellectual sense that someone like Aquinas or Plato did. They have kind of meaningful faith, but they don't have the kind of same framework that even like a Greek pagan had that was closer to Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, God's not dead. He is surely alive. There was those God's not dead movies. I
Like
think they almost,
Dynasty.
they wanted to prove God almost because there was this deeply emotional, charismatic experience. There are these, rap artists on stage singing "God's Not Dead," and all these kids are going wild. I envy them in many ways, but I do agree that they are not as close. They're further away from being a Christian than Plato was. Um, what do you think about Nietzsche's radical critique that you can actually find in Beyond Good and Evil? And Nietzsche being Nietzsche, he never goes into it. This is a guy who jumps from peak to peak and dips his toe in, throws darts, whatever metaphor you want to use. He is, one of the reasons why he's such a famous writer is that he's fun to read, but he, infinitely more enjoyable than reading Kant, for instance. But he also kind of leaves a lot for you to decipher on your own. I do think there is a system there. I don't think he's merely a op-ed writer, a tweeter or something, but you in some ways have to explore it yourself because of his condition and life. He was writing fast and loose to some extent, although I think he got a tremendous amount correct. But it comes in Beyond Good and Evil, and he is essentially suggesting that the grammar of language is what is leading us towards a notion of a creator God. So sentences, and I think this holds for effectively most all language, even if grammar can be kind of rearranged in different languages. Much like in Hungary, you say the last name first and the first name last or something. It's still the same fundamental grammar. And he was suggesting that grammar kind of implies a creator God in the sense that there is a subject and a verb and a predicate. I hit the baseball. And because that is so ingrained in us, and I shouldn't even say this, we can't think without using language, without using logic, logos, words. And so, to really, there's in a way there's nothing outside of language that we can rationally discuss. There might be something beyond it that we can kind of approach, but we are kind of trapped in grammar in some ways. And his point was that because sentences have a subject, a verb, and a predicate, we assume that there must be a big, he out there who created the universe, verb, predicate, universe. And so this was kind of like built into our grammar, and it's, been with us since the beginning, but it's always been a matter of logos or grammar or language, and it's not really been a matter of reality. We project this logic onto reality, and reality kind of laughs. I mean, as Nietzsche explicitly says, the universe has no morality, and any attempt to um, find it there is just merely a matter of projection. So he kind of he radically dissolves the question of whether God exists. And then I think but doesn't certainly answer it. And he kind of tantalizingly allows us to, become aware of that and then think through all of its implications. But what are your thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, so you're going to get me back on the Richard Weaver train of blaming Occam for everything, saying William of Occam destroyed civilization. I do think that in this particular case, there's actually kind of continuity here, because Nietzsche is getting this view from kind of Kantianism. Kant was extremely influential on Nietzsche in his early intellectual formation. He was getting Kant primarily by way of Schopenhauer and Friedrich Lange, I think. Lange had a strange interpretation of Kant's system of transcendental idealism, according to which the forms and the categories through which we apprehend reality are basically like conditions of our specifically human, kind of like contingent physical and biological nature, which is not how Kant understood himself. But that was Lange's interpretation. So it's easy to see how, if that's your interpretation of Kant, and if you're accepting a certain kind of representational epistemology from Kant that holds out the thing in itself, that's the big thing that distinguishes Schopenhauer from Hegel and the German idealists. One of the major things that Schopenhauer thinks that there's a kind of reality in itself that's knowable only by way of kind of aesthetic experience, by way of will, rather than by ratiocination.
Mm-hmm. The infinite pain of existence out there. Yes.
Right. We can be aware, which is Kant in a certain way also thinks that, right? That our contact with the noumenal for Kant is through our moral conscience. That's through will in a certain sense. And Schopenhauer carries this over, but has a kind of aesthetic interpretation of that. But Nietzsche's taking over this epistemological framework from Kant, ultimately, even though Nietzsche is a harsh critic of Kant's moral philosophy. But that epistemological framework, I think, which is kind of the culmination of modern philosophy, modern Western philosophy, beginning with Descartes. I think that the Weaver thesis is actually kind of indicated here, that it makes sense if you embrace an Occamite nominalist view, according to which the form of thought and the form of being are not one and the same thing.
Right.
The world that we encounter, to get back to the problem of the one and the many that we were discussing earlier, for Occam, the world that we encounter are all radically individual entities, radically individuated substances. They do have forms, but they have, for Occam, he's a realist with respect to form, but their forms are all individual. The form of Socrates is Socrates. It's not like Socrates has a form of humanity that he shares with Plato or anything like that. And then the kind of activity of conceptually organizing the world, of giving it intelligibility through unity, recognizing that Socrates and Plato are both men, that's merely on our side. That's a kind of conceptual power of the mind to organize the world in a way that seems fitting. There's a kind of question of like, what's the truth maker? Like, what makes the certain organization of the world plausible and other organizations implausible? Well, it doesn't seem like there's any criterion, but that becomes obviously a problem for Nietzsche in the 20th century, when we think that these basic concepts through which we organize the world might be radically contingent. Either they're completely arbitrary or they're kind of culturally given to us. But if you don't share that view, which says that what we primarily know are our representations, what we primarily know are our own concepts or our own ideas, and then beyond that, there's something in itself that's not really intelligible in itself. It has to be conceptually organized by the mind before it's made intelligible. Well, then I think you really do get this worrisome modern view, according to which, well, even if you can concoct an argument for the existence of God, a grammatical argument, a causal argument, which is ultimately a kind of grammatical argument on this view, there's a kind of underlying skepticism. How do we know that the forms by which we apprehend reality really map onto the way things are in themselves? And I think that Christianity only really makes sense in its historical context if you have a radically different view of how the mind and the world relate to one another. That when we apprehend reality, there's a kind of unity or identity of being and thinking. The mind and its object are identical, and we're apprehending the natural structures of being, or the essential structures.
This goes back to the Gospel of John as well. I mean, he is the Word made flesh. The Word was with God, and God was with the Word. There's a unification of logos, which is the exact word used there, and God, the Father and the Son as well. And that is a absolutely necessary component to Christianity. For someone like Nietzsche, who's was devoutly Lutheran in his youth, son of a pastor and all that. He was breaking that down, and he ended up where he ended up, which is calling upon we need to birth a super being and all this kind of stuff. So I do think that to be a proper Christian, you must connect those things. Your thinking and your use of reason or logos words must be not equated with the universe, but it must be the same thing. You can't make that argument of you're projecting or kind of mapping reason onto the world and the world laughs, which is pretty much Nietzsche's standpoint.
Right. I think this is one of the most interesting critiques Hegel has of Kant. So in the opening of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel criticizes Kant for his instrumental theory of cognition. Kant thinks that knowledge is some kind of, it's like a telescope or something. It's this lens that lets us grasp the world. But in letting us grasp the object, it distorts the image of the object. So we never really get the thing in itself. We get this distorted appearance. And there's a kind of interesting connection between, on the one hand, Kant's epistemology and his metaphysics, and then on the other hand, his philosophy of religion, where Kant thinks, insofar as Christ, I mean, this is somewhat of something of a caricature of Kant. I think his view is a little bit more complicated than this, but a common liberal Christian reading is that insofar as the positive content of Christianity matters, Christ is the deliverer of the good news. Basically, like you said earlier, treat your neighbors nicely, like be nice. And that's the moral message of Christianity. But Hegel points out that Christ doesn't say, I'm the bearer of the truth. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. The truth is not identified with a set of propositions that you can accept or decline. The truth is identified with an ontological reality, with being itself. That is with Christ. He is truth. And he's not a true thing, and he's not a deliverer of true things. So Christianity, I think, is a radical metaphysical thesis about the nature of reality and how the mind apprehends that reality. Importantly, I think, at the foundations of Latin Christianity, Augustinian epistemology is a theory of divine illumination. What it means for us to know things is for us to be enlightened or to participate in the mind of God. God creates the world by knowing himself, by knowing the various forms contained in himself, and that we know the world by kind of participating in those divine ideas. And it's that epistemological thesis that underlies the possibility of knowledge for Augustine. And if you embrace Occam and you have this nominalist view that, the ideas that we know are just contained in our own mind, and they're a kind of lens, like Kant says, structures are apprehension of a radically alien reality, well, then the whole framework starts to break down. And then I think that Nietzsche becomes very plausible, or this kind of Nietzschean view that we need to kind of create through an act of will our own order of values, because this alien reality can't legislate or prescribe anything to us. It's a much more plausible view.
Yes. Yeah. All right. This has been great. Let's open it up to some guests And we have a number of people requested to come in, and I can allow in some others. So just some ground rules. I or Xbox Live, my co-host, will call on you, and obviously be respectful to everyone here, and but try to get to a question and spark some discussion by the two of us. Get off your soapbox. Let's say it that way. Okay. So I'm just going to go in order here that I see. So I'm going to go with Lala first. Lala, welcome.
Amazing. Thank you guys. This is one of the first like highly intellectual Twitter spaces I've been a part of, or that I've listened into. There's a lot of nonsense on Twitter spaces, but this has been really, really good. So thanks guys for sharing. So I'd love to hear what you guys think about this, because my thesis is that, society always moves in these extremes. We kind of move from one extreme to the other, and we're moving away from this place of modernism, right? Where we've kind of had this idea that man is the measure of all things, and that we're able to know everything in and of ourselves. And that's why we're seeing this huge wave of people that would define themselves as spiritual, and people who would claim some level of spirituality. And so I'm wondering if some of these like kind of more, if you want to call them ancient, or at least like, pre-modern concepts of, for instance, like modalism, of us all, of everything being made up of like particles of the mind of God. I mean, I kind of see that as akin to a lot of new age philosophies that are saying, we're all one. God is expressed through all of us. And so I'm very interested to hear, as someone who identifies as Christian, I see that there is this swing back towards this kind of spiritual side, but it's almost in a way that is a bit pre-modern in its core philosophy. So I'm interested to hear your takes on that. Really loved the philosophic conversation. It's just something that we don't do enough. So thanks again.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, I definitely don't deny that there is a great deal of anxiety and desire for what you're describing. That the modern world, it's gray on gray. It can't really fulfill us. You can't really be fulfilled by your, townhouse in the city and cool car. At some point, it's just all empty, and you want something, but the modern world can't really offer you that. We're proud of our separation of church and state and tolerance and so on, and so it can't fulfill that need that I think is sincerely felt by millions of people. That being said, although you might see a lot of people, jumping into an ancient religion on Twitter, I see that too. You shouldn't be biased just by your timeline. I mean, there are clear statistics of a rising atheism in the country. And where exactly that will lead, I think, is debatable and an open-ended question. But at this point, unchurched and atheist Americans are at the same level of the religious right or evangelical Christians in the early 2000s. So it really is growing. And even those people, even if, say, 65% of Americans identify as Christian, the kind of fuzzy blob in the sky that they think of, it might not really be satisfactory to call yourself Christian. So I think they're kind of like two different tendencies going on. There is a slow creeping atheism, and there's a reaction. And I'm not sure about a metaphysical framework being put back into place, but I do think that there is going to be a reaction against the secular world. And we're not quite seeing it yet. I think, overall in the past 10 years, the next 10 years, and in the next decade after that, I think we will see a kind of creeping agnosticism, atheism, unchurched or whatever. But I don't think we'll ever reach a secular society. I think there's going to be a very strong reaction, and I don't say that is something that I'm longing for. Actually, I think the reaction against our current society might be it's might very well be something. Let's put it that way. But it might very well be primitive and violent.
Yeah. So on the whole, I'm not as I'm not as optimistic as many contemporary kind of conservative Christians about the prospect of a religious reawakening in the United States on the Christian right. I think that there is some evidence that more religious people have more children, and that their children are tend to be more religious. So intergenerationally, maybe there will be some kind of return of um, Orthodox Christian, I mean lowercase o Orthodox, conservative Protestant and Catholic Christianity in the United States and Western Europe. But I think in the near term, Richard is right that Christianity as a kind of pre-theoretical or non-philosophical cultural force is kind of spent in the United States. And it had its kind of maybe political heyday, which was really empty during the Bush years. It didn't achieve very much.
Mm-hmm.
And now the United States, which has long been predicted to be kind of holdout against Western European style secularism, is on the very same trajectory as Western Europe. I do think that there is a kind of like long repressed spiritual or religious instinct that people do have, but that this is likely to just be funneled into mostly just nonsense like New Age religion, like kind of bastardized Western interpretations of Hinduism, people believing in crystals and strange things like that. That's very popular among a certain segment of young people. And then also, I think that this is redirected into ideology, which is a kind of immanentization of religion.
Yes.
The kind of realization of a worldly eternity or worldly perfection through human technology, basically. I don't mean that in like a transhuman sense, but I mean like ways of technology in the broader sense of like human conscious organization of our social forms. Communism is obviously like the paradigmatic example of that, but obviously, we have kind of replacement ideologies today that function as ways of, I think, a kind of like the dominant ideology of the progressive left, I think, is a kind of romantic individualism of self-expression. And that has kind of religious undertones. You discover your inner truth or something like that. And I think it's intellectually incoherent, but I think that that's a common kind of, that will kind of be the main replacement for Christianity in the American centrist and center-left political culture, I think.
I think I largely agree. One thing that I would add is that they are replacement religions, but they're heresies in an important way. Like if you look at a religion like QAnon, which you could call a fraud, ridiculous, a political op, etc. All of that is true, of course. But it maintained the structure of Christianity, and in the sense that there was a moment of redemption, maybe a second coming, maybe Trump is sort of the son of man. I know someone actually wrote a book on that, or a fallen Messiah or something. It's loose, but it maintains the structure of Christianity. So even in these replacement religion, heresies, we're still kind of trapped within a Christian way of thinking. And I do find that interesting. I mean, it's also to look at the left from a critical lens. It's not wrong when conservatives are like, you don't believe in Jesus, but you think that George Floyd is your Messiah or something. Now that's mostly meant as just a kind of cheap insult, but I think it actually is getting at something that even if a new age nonsensical religion emerged, it would kind of maintain the structure of Christianity. It would be I would suggest, you might disagree, I would suggest that it would largely be monotheistic, and I think it would offer redemption. It would probably be light on the atonement for sin, but I think it would offer redemption and might even offer a messianic figure as well.
I mostly agree. I think you and I have discussed this in previous spaces. We didn't get, we mentioned it, but we didn't get around to discussing in detail. I agree with many people who think that liberalism is essentially a Christian heresy, and was unintelligible outside of a Christian context. Obviously, there are not historically Christian societies which have adopted liberalism or Marxist-Leninism or whatever, But usually those are westernized intellectuals from those countries who adopt those systems, or they become so kind of transformed in their new non-Christian context that they don't really have a lot intellectually to do with kind of historic liberalism or Christianity or Marxist-Leninism. So I agree with that. I don't think there's any kind of necessary and inevitable transformation of Christianity into modern liberalism, because I don't think that history has that kind of intellectual teleological structure that many critics of Christianity on the right think that there's this evolution. Christianity is proto-Marxism or whatever. Yeah, I think that the modern left or progressive post-Christian moral theology, there's a variety of Christian elements to it. Sometimes a term that gets used is morally therapeutic deism. That I think there's a sociology study from the 1990s that wrote kind of predicted that will be the dominant replacement for Christianity. It's deism because God doesn't have any kind of he's maybe a creator God or a kind of moral conscience, but he doesn't have much of an active role in forming the world. But he kind of God is your best friend. He kind of morally soothes you and helps to deal with all of your neurotic pathologies of living in modern capitalism. So it's a kind of Christianity for the workplace, basically, HR Christianity to help kind of manage. I think some tendencies on the right of young men getting really interested in Stoicism. I don't know if you've seen this, Richard, but
I've definitely seen this. Yeah.
Yeah, people get really into reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which I think is worthwhile. It's a great text, but this is obviously a kind of an attempt to appropriate a pre-Christian, but in some ways proto-Christian Stoic moral culture for modern kind of neoliberalism. I think the modern left.
Well, as you know, Xbox, I mean, eat steaks, lift heavy weights, and read the Bible. That's what the establishment hates. Get on, take the Tate pill, my man.
Yeah, the establishment, especially when you cook with gas stoves, apparently.
Oh yeah, I mean that
yeah.
You're full on ortho. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is true that the kind of theory of the atonement, I mean, it only makes sense if you have a certain conception of guilt rather than shame as kind of your overriding moral ideal of honor. And that's a distinctively Abrahamic ideal. And obviously that's guiding so much of the left's modern, especially racial politics. It's this conception of guilt.
Yes.
Yeah, I basically agree with you, Richard.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Lola. And I am going to move on to Aaron. You are next on the list. So Aaron Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I was just curious, Richard, what your upbringing in Christianity was, and then I was curious what, given everything you two have said, what was Kant's contribution to philosophy generally a positive or a negative thing? And that is all. Thank you.
Very good questions. I was raised as an Episcopalian, and I was confirmed, and I actually do attend Episcopalian church. I'm perhaps not the greatest Episcopalian out there, but I am one, and I actually do feel at home or comfortable in the church. I know what is going on. There Episcopalians get bashed for being, liberals and so on, but I actually appreciate a lot of what they do, and I generally like it. It does. You can criticize Episcopalians for being liberals, but we are actually reasonable, civilized people as well. So there's something to be said for that. We've never handled snakes, but I also will be honest with you. I do understand myself as a Nietzschean, and well, you can take from that what you will. I'm also involved in something that will probably drive Xbox up a tree, and so maybe we shouldn't talk about it too much. But an apologism project that is in the spirit of Nietzsche, reviving a Greco-Roman system. But I'll leave it there. And in terms of Kant, I think Kant made a tremendous contribution. I agree with Xbox when he was mentioning this earlier, that Nietzsche himself is a kind of Kantian. We know that he read Schopenhauer through and through. That's clear. And he probably did receive Kant, maybe entirely, in fact, via Schopenhauer. Kant gets name dropped a few times. He actually gets name dropped in The Birth of Tragedy and elsewhere. And certainly Nietzsche would dismiss his moral doctrine. For Nietzsche, morality is, you need to go to the history of morality. You need to go digging deep of why we developed concepts like guilt and so on, and morality does, and you have to look at the history of resentment and the idea of tearing someone apart psychologically who you can't dominate, all the kind of good stuff, master slave, all that kind of stuff. But so he's not a Kantian moralist, obviously, but I do think that the fundamental achievement of Kant, which is a separation between the phenomenal and noumenal worlds, basically what we can perceive and the reality that we create in our head versus knowing a thing in itself or even knowing God. I think that contribution was a necessary step in philosophy, and it had humongous importance, immeasurable importance for people like Nietzsche and for people like myself who believe what I believe. So there it is.
Yeah. So I work primarily on Kant, so I'll never get tired of talking about how he's very important, especially when I go out for job talks. He's the most important philosopher. You have to hire me to teach.
Well, I agree.
I think that just to answer the stuff on Kant, instead of the autobiographical details, my story's boring. I'm Roman Catholic. But the Kant stuff, there's a surprising amount of scholarship recently on Kant's influence on Nietzsche. I say surprising because historically, early 20th century, Nietzsche is just considered a harsh critic of Kant. Nietzsche, I think, famously referred to Kant as something like an accursed spider, or that degenerate spider, Kant, which is very funny. But Nietzsche was strongly influenced by Kant. There's a book by Kevin Hill called Nietzsche's Critiques, and it's about Kant's influence on Nietzsche. So Nietzsche probably, if I remember that book correctly, he probably did read at least the first critique, but his interpretation of Kant was heavily filtered, like you said, through interpreters, so mostly Schopenhauer and Friedrich Lange. He took over from Kant, primarily Kant's theoretical philosophy. Now, I think that, we discussed earlier some of the problems, I think, in Kant's theoretical philosophy, his view of cognition as an instrument that distances you from what's really real, the thing in itself. At least that's a common interpretation of Kant. Some people will criticize that. But I think that's a real problem. Nonetheless, there are important theoretical contributions that Kant made. I think one of the most important is a portion in the first critique. He says, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. It's a really famous quote from the preface of the first critique. And basically what he's saying is that all of our thinking has some aboutness, some relationship to an object that supplies kind of the matter of that thinking. But we never have just empty experiences of brute material entities, the way that a lot of early modern empiricists claim. Instead, because their account is like we experience these brute material objects that have no forms, and then we kind of conceptually in our minds, constitute some kind of form or some kind of universal concept to organize this unintelligible mass of experience. For Kant, our experience of the world is already conceptually informed. We already have these conceptual forms by which we organize the world, and that is able to save, in Kant's view, the possibility of science, the intelligibility of the world, because the world already has a certain structure that's not arbitrary. You don't have to have a kind of skeptical concern about that structure. Now, people following Kant think that, these structures with which we order experience, that we already take with us prior to experience, they might be inherited from kind of contingent cultural situation, and therefore there's a kind of underlying skepticism or relativism that Kant disavows. But I think that that's very important to kind of preserve the centrality of form in cognition. Nietzsche obviously dissents from Kant's practical philosophy. A lot of Christians, and especially Catholics, hate Kant's practical philosophy because they think he's some kind of proto-libertarian or something. I think it's total nonsense. Kant's practical philosophy is basically a natural law theory, and he's defending a kind of conservative Lutheran moral conventional attitudes of the time. So that's kind of my view of Kant. Mixed bag, but overall, I think he's absolutely central, and everybody with an interest in philosophy needs to get around to reading him at some point.
Very good. Okay, the winner, 2875.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm quite like Christian philosophy, and there's a lot of stuff there that appeals to me. So I guess this question is for Xbox Live Republican. My question is, so I feel like Kierkegaard, to me, you probably wouldn't like Kierkegaard as much, because it seems like you're more interested in Catholic philosophy, and specifically to do with certain more philosophical arguments for proving of God, while Kierkegaard kind of stresses faith above everything else. But I kind of find it difficult to approach God from a philosophical perspective, because I don't know if you know about Heidegger's idea of onto-theology, but if you're thinking on like a deeper philosophical level, then you arrive at the question of kind of the distinction between being and beings. And God, I guess Aquinas had the idea that God is somehow both a being and being itself, but I don't think that really makes sense from a Heideggerian perspective, because being has to be something that is not a being. There's like an ontological gap between those two different things. So I guess my question is, how could God exist without either being subordinate to being, because if God was a being, he would be subordinate to it, or if God isn't a being, then wouldn't that just mean that God doesn't exist?
Right. So there's a common tendency among a lot of Thomistic apologists today, especially online, to very strongly emphasize this kind of apophatic character of Aquinas' thought, and to deny that God is a being. And this is problematic because Aquinas repeatedly says that God is an ens, which means a being, which seems to leave him open to the Heideggerian critique. Now, I think that Aquinas' position sounds like it's open to the Heideggerian critique, but actually it's a lot more nuanced. So Heidegger, because Heidegger was educated in medieval philosophy, he was originally getting a PhD in theology, raised Catholic, and then converted to Lutheranism, and then who knows what happened later in his life. It's highly contested. But he was studying medieval theology, medieval philosophy from a Scotist perspective, and I believe he wrote his dissertation on Scotus. Now, certain Scotists on Twitter might get mad at me for saying this, and I'm not an expert on Scotus, but a common narrative of the problem of onto-theology blames Duns Scotus. Radical Orthodox people like John Milbank say this. I'm very skeptical about Milbank because contemporary medieval philosophers don't think his Scotus scholarship is very good. But the narrative goes something like, Scotus, in affirming the univocity of being, the claim that all beings are being in the same way, at least from a semantic point of view, if not a metaphysical one, he turns God into one entity like the others that just perform special functions. God is an infinite entity, but he's an entity, a being like the others. That kind of leaves you open to the onto-theological objection. Aquinas' position is a little bit different. So, first of all, Aquinas affirms the analogy of being, the sense in which God is a being, and the sense in which other things, created things, are beings, is very different. So God's not a substance, he's not an accident, whatever. Aquinas also denies that being is genus. So the transcendental category of being, or the transcendental of being, it's transcendental because it's beyond the categories. It's not a genus, so God's not subordinate to some kind of kind. Same thing with divinity. God is his own act of being, and God is his own divinity. It's not like he participates in some kind of being that is higher than him. Now, the way in which, for Aquinas, God is individuated, what makes him a particular being rather than just being itself, Aquinas distinguishes between ens commune, which is like common being, the kind of being that like a table and chair have in common. And for him, that's merely conceptual. That's not like real being in the world. That's a kind of abstraction in the mind. And then ipsum esse, pure being, the act of being itself, and that's the being of God. For Aquinas, most things are, if they're material, they're individuated by their matter, but they're distinguished as the kind of things that they are by their forms, but they are not their own forms. So like Socrates and Plato both have the form of humanity that makes them the kind of thing that they are, and then they're individuated by their distinct matter. God is immaterial, but he's both individuated and distinguished by his form, but he is his own form. So that's a very roundabout way of saying it. Like, I think Aquinas is able to avoid the objection of onto-theology, but he has like a very elaborate metaphysics that involves like God is individuated through the purity of his own form because God is not subject to any genus. So the purity of his being is what distinguishes him from other kinds of determinate beings. There's a guy named, I think, Richard Caputo, who wrote a book on Heidegger and Aquinas, where he kind of investigates these defenses of Aquinas from Heideggerian objections. He ultimately sided with Heidegger. He thinks Aquinas is an onto-theologian. But anyway, I think Aquinas is able to defend himself from the charge of onto-theology. But that's kind of the long answer, I guess. So, yeah.
Well, that went over my head, but I do appreciate your saying that. Okay, I will move on to, but I won't comment. I will move on to Mr. Nice Guy.
Hey, Richard.
There you are.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say I've always enjoyed your work, and I'm from Alabama and Georgia area, so a lot of the stuff you spoke on in 2020 really related, or 2016 or whatever, really hit the spot on some of the stuff that goes on down here. For me personally, Richard and Xbox, for me, I've kind of got the concept that God isn't a being, but it's the fundamental rules of our universe that kind of guide the personality of God. And I guess what I really wanted to touch on besides that aspect is, what modern times have really done has weeded out the people who are not at genetic disposition for being Christian. Some people have to work at it, but then there are people who are born into a certain set of morality. I think it comes with who you are. And, a large portion of Christians now, or who were formerly Christians, are the ones who conform to what the populace think or what they view as the populace. And I think that's a lot of what we're experiencing now. The same people who long ago would burn witches at the stake are the same modern liberals who, for example, were willing to burn you to at the stake, or anyone who questions the mainstream narrative. I think it's overall a good thing that Christianity has dropped, but only in the sense that people who really did not care for it or really believed in it are now weeded out instead of looking at it as a virtue in society. What's your take?
Well, okay. This is what I think you're saying. So this I agree with completely, which is that there's a certain Christian quality to Elizabeth Warren, or in the previous generations of Elizabeth Warrens would have been Puritans or something, and she's carried the theology. Maybe it has been disseminated, but also there's just a certain kind of cast of mind or tendency that's of her personality that leads her to denounce heretics. and
exactly.
So I think I totally agree with that. And America is a unique place in the sense of its founding. It was like a selection event at the beginning of America for hyper nonconformist, hyper moralist. Whatever personality types led to that came here. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower were rejecting what was a completely civilized and tolerant form of Christianity, but it wasn't good enough for them. And so it wasn't really people escaping religious persecution. They were almost escaping the lack of religious persecution. Like they wanted to go somewhere, like this, New Jerusalem gathering of extremists. And I think that has inflected American history and the American psyche to a really great degree, and one that's maybe been underappreciated. I agree with that.
Well, I just want to follow up and say, not to interrupt you, I'm sorry, but to say that as Christianity falls, that is going to be replaced by something. And for the people who conformed to society to look for their morality, now with mainstream media and technology, they fall into this new religion that worships science based on, scientists and the peer-to-peer reviews, when in some cases it's just, bullshit.
Yeah. And so you're saying that people are getting persecuted by these like post-Christians, and so they won't be Christian in the future? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the people who persecute now, if you would go back a few hundred years ago, these were the same people who were persecuting non-Christians.
I
Like their
totally agree.
their
Or other
Christianity,
Christians who weren't extreme enough. Yes.
right? They conform to the new modern religion that society has put forth, and it's the liberal lefty agenda.
I agree.
Yeah, I basically agree with everything Richard said in response to that question. One thing that you brought up is the tendency among young progressives to turn science into a religion. Now, sometimes I think that phrase, turning science into a religion or whatever, I think that can be like a tired conservative talking point. But I do think there is some truth that, like, when people say, as they saw, and this is like a fairly recent phenomenon, obviously global warming debates have been happening for decades. Like within the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, trust the science has become like a huge prominent phrase on the left. Obviously, the people who say stuff like that are not themselves actual scientists who are like doing, publishing like peer-reviewed research or like compiling, literature reviews of scientific studies. It signals the kind of trust for science, like established institutionalized scientists, who I do think to some extent deserve a certain amount of credibility and trust, but
Sure.
accepts them as kind of like not just epistemic authorities, which it accepts this very uncritically, and we should have a somewhat skeptical view because they're operating institutions, they're subject to social and political pressure, whatever, but it also accepts them as moral authorities. So like Neil deGrasse Tyson is called upon not just to talk about like whatever astrophysics thing he did at Harvard 30 years ago, but he's called upon to discuss like moral matters. So there's this like really stupid tweet that he posted several years ago of like a Google Earth picture of like the United States and Mexico, and he's like, I don't see any lines, like borders are made up. And like they have become like a kind of priestly class whose class prejudices, which are just drawn from this kind of like multicultural, over-socialized American elite university, STEM class, basically.
Yeah.
They're now like the new clergy of our society. And I think that's terrible. Like, I think these people have like awful opinions and awful taste. So I do think that's a real problem. Like,
he said something recently about how, human beings are bags of chemicals, and sometimes bags of chemicals need to ask for help.
Yeah.
It's just like so awful. But yeah, I think there's also kind of a funny assumption that is at the basis of like the girl who ran the I fucking love science Facebook page, which was big 10 or 15 years ago. And all of these people like holding up Fauci signs and dancing to getting vaccinated and something. I mean, let me put in here, as you know, I'm pro-vax and I, so on. I'm not like against this on its most basic level, but the kind of like assumption that science is liberalism or like it's very funny. It's like the idea that you would ever look to Neil deGrasse Tyson as a moral authority, or that what science is doing is going to lead us to be more multicultural and loving or something, is hilarious that they believe this.
Right. It's like if they were to take a look at like early to mid 20th century anthropology, like these people had very different views on
Exactly.
most of the moral questions of the day. And like obviously scientific discoveries can inform people's moral attitudes or opinions, but I think that it has very little to do. The fact that Neil deGrasse Tyson has very little to, that he's a scientist, has very little to do with his moral opinions compared to the fact that he's a professor, that he's an academic. And he's a so-called public intellectual, whatever that means.
Well,
Yeah,
isn't
he's gotta
trust
get
the
on.
science? Isn't
He's gotta
trust the
get on with
science the
college.
modern day have faith?
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Right.
All right, let's move on because we have a lot of people who've requested, and I don't want to extend this into a 4-hour space, as I've sometimes done. But Mr. Nice Guy, thanks for your kind words and thanks for your contribution.
Thank you, too, Richard.
Yeah, okay. And so I'm going to go to Future Citizen.
Hello, yeah. I just thought I'd float a question to the panel, or you guys seem pretty knowledgeable. I've been peripherally looking at Jay Dyer's belief in Orthodoxy in his recent debate with Church Militant. I just had a question in regards what you guys think of prophecy, or in regards to like Daniel in the image of man, and we know that Christian thought, even I think pretty unilaterally regard through the sects, they believe that interfaith would be a sign of the Antichrist. In terms of Revelation, these religious harlot, it is called, will be in control of some sort of seven-headed beast. And in the image of David, I think even I read some Roman Catholic interpretations of that, of those four world powers being, Babylon and the Medo-Persians, and then Greece and Rome, and then we're the bottom, Anglo-American power. I just thought, what is the consensus among Romans and Orthodoxy in regards to prophecy and end times? And I guess just one more thing is that there was recently a documentary that was put out about evangelicals in like support of Israel, thinking that they're the chosen people still, and that once Christ comes to earth and rules over Israel, then they'll be, sent up by rapture, which is just bizarro. But I thought I'd get your answers on those.
Sure, you can go first, Xbox, if you like.
Sure. Yeah. So as far as prophecy is concerned, as a Roman Catholic, like I believe, I think you have to believe in prophecy, biblical prophecies. I also believe in Marian apparitions. So I think there have been more recent prophecies that have been disclosed. But I think it's very dangerous to just kind of like begin interpreting these on your own. But nonetheless, I understand the temptation, and at times I do think that kind of modern progressive liberalism, there is something kind of like profoundly disordered about this ideology, this ecumenical progressive liberal faith, that is more Luciferian in the proper sense of the term than other disordered ideologies of the 19th and 20th century. In the proper Luciferian sense, because the great Luciferian sin of pride is trying to reorder, in a kind of Nietzschean way, to kind of reorder the moral cosmos around your own will, apart from subordination to a divine law. And I think that's kind of like the defining feature of kind of romanticist sentimentality on the progressive left, is kind of the denial of any independent normative order of God or nature or whatever, and kind of recreation of the self through an act of will. I don't think, it's easy to say that like the apocalypse is imminent. Martin Luther thought that the Pope was the Antichrist and the world would end in the 16th century. And the early apostles thought that. So I try not to get too excited about this sort of stuff, but there are like very concerning features of the modern left. Also, I think that evangelical support, which does extend to Catholics as well, and mainline Protestants, but especially white evangelical support for Israel in the United States, I don't think this actually has much to do with historic Christianity, which maybe we don't want to discuss on Twitter, historic Christianity's relationship to European Jews. But I think that this is a creation mostly of the mid-20th century. There were like mid to late 19th century, like exclusively basically low church Protestant Zionist movements. But they usually, like many of the famous ones, thought that various European ethnic groups were actually like lost tribes of Israel. Mormons kind of think this, but there was like a British Hebrew Israelite movement, like the modern Black Hebrew Israelites, which is like obviously absurd. But I think that like modern evangelical Zionism in the United States is like a creation of the 1970s. And I think it's largely like a political fabrication that like organizations like AIPAC and a lot of like ecumenical conferences among like Southern Baptist Convention types have produced this. I think it's like nonsense. I mean, not that your question's nonsense, but like this ideology, I think, is like terrible nonsense.
Well, I hesitate to talk about this a little bit because it would get us on a different track. But when something is this popular and this powerful, I think it's dangerous just to call it nonsense or to think of it as some misunderstanding that occurred. There is a, in terms of support for Israel, evangelical Christians love Israel literally more than the Jews. That is a remarkable statistic. And yeah, this extends into Catholics, this extends to mainline Protestants, but even among the kind of liberal mainline Protestants and Catholics, you'll get some pushback and criticism of Israel, and they don't really, you will get less of the chosen people stuff and covenant with God stuff and so on. So if a phenomenon is this powerful, there must be something to it. And I think I might just leave it at that. I could talk at length about this, but I don't think it's mere nonsense or a mere mistake. Let me just put it that way.
If I could just give one final comment. When I say it's nonsense, I'm not saying that there's no theological basis whatsoever for this. So evangelicals will give arguments that I think don't have, like, you could say they have a historical basis, but historically people did not draw the conclusions that modern, late 20th, early 21st century evangelicals drew from these passages of the New Testament. This is like a very modern view. I think that the movers and shakers on the question of U.S. foreign policy for Israel are mostly not white evangelicals.
Yes.
There are other groups, and those other, which I'm not just referring to one group. I mean, there are, which obviously we don't have to name that, but like there's a variety of other
involved in American.
Yeah, there's tons of WASPs. Yeah. So like that's also not me denying that other group is involved, but it's mostly like the people who decide U.S. foreign policy are elites who don't believe in Christian Zionism.
Correct.
Or like only a small number of them do. And I think that those people have set up Christian Zionism as like an institutional scheme to manipulate voters who historically, if they're legacy Americans, their ancestors did not believe in this stuff. And I guess we can leave it at that. But that's my take on this phenomenon, which I think is manufactured.
I agree. Again, we have a lot of common ground here. I would just suggest that it is true that there have been atrocities and expulsions and so on throughout European history by Christians towards Jews, and yet Jews succeeded and were a deep part of it. So I think there is a question that's being begged there. But I think we should maybe just leave it at that. It's a very difficult issue, and I'm not trying to be cowardly or something. I think this can be discussed like rationally and reasonably, of course, but it's a huge discussion, and it can get a bit painful in some ways. Anyway, I will move on. Thank you, future citizen, for your question, and let's go to Paul.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so does God exist? And I would say yes. I think everyone kind of is saying the same thing, that God is kind of what it binds us, right? That God, well, in the Greek, they said that theos or deos is literally to bind or to be bound. And so I think that people want to hold on to something, right? We want to hold something in our hands physically, have this kind of static moment or something that we have something for sure. And there's something to that, right? I mean, what is the only thing we can be sure of? It's kind of like when we count 1, 2, 3, 4, right? These integer values, right? We count with our fingers, but it's not so like simple, right? That we actually have kind of, well, I don't want to get there yet, but I think what binds us all is energy. The most commonly accepted theory is that energy binds us all, right? That everyone graduates from high school and we have to pass probably some kind of test that we say that energy is conserved, that everyone kind of, whether they understand that, they do believe that we put gasoline in our cars, right? And I think we're heading towards that energy itself is quantized, right? That you understand that the hydrogen atom, the energy itself is quantized and all that. And I think this heads into transcendentalism, this kind of surmounting or these kind of never-ending overcomings or this infinite scaling, it seems, right? That how do we, I think someone said telescoping of knowledge, and it kind of distorts. And I think it's what we would call magnetism. That magnetism literally means the study of scaling or relevance, right? And like I said, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's a little bit different, right? There's what we call special relativity.
Okay,
So
well, I need to get a question here.
Can I go on
do you have a question?
Can I go on a little bit longer?
You're taking so many leaps. You do this a lot. You'll say something and then jump from that and then jump from that, and I don't always follow.
Okay. All right. Well,
so do you have a question?
Do I have a question?
Yeah.
Well, I have some pushback because you said that. Well, somebody said God is necessary to explain, right? And then you were kind of saying that you weren't sure that we could prove the Big Bang or whatever, right? Because it seems kind of infinite. Well, the sun itself is somewhat of an infinite value, or it's dimensionless. It's kind of this constant value. But there's a distance to it, and we can figure that out, right? And that's because of calculus, that the form exists at the limit. The sun is a constant, but if you integrate a constant, you get a linear function, right? Or a line or a distance. And then the warmth of the sun, the temperature is scaled, right? There's a scaling. So during the summer, it feels warmer, and during the winter, it feels colder, right? So we can feel God, or we can kind of understand it, and we can't put our hands on things, but there is kind of these special kind of instances, but we're kind of moving towards this. What is God? Well, God, the only thing we can kind of be sure of are these numbers, right? I mean, there's a whole book in the Bible.
Oh, okay. Look, let me just, I need to jump onto something that I understand. So you, through something that is sensual, what you are positing is that we can grasp something that is noumenal or beyond the senses. So through the heat of the sun, we can feel God in a way.
Because during the noontime, you can't even really look at the sun. It's totally dimensionless, right? You can't even look at it. But through some kind of projection, we can figure out time and distance, right? And this is through this calculus, this kind of form existing at the limits as you approach infinity. And then there's one more. I think you are onto something as far as like grammar, right? And I think you're getting into what mathematically they're called eigenfunctions and eigenvalues, which is kind of interesting. Which like eigen means like self or ego or something like that. Which in Hebrew God is I am or to be or some kind of being. But yeah, I think that's kind of it.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Okay, let us go to Nara V.
Hi, Richard.
I'm looking at your profile right now. I am excited about the cool stuff you're going to ask us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to you and Xbox. And this has just been a really interesting conversation. Of course, when we get into religion or God, it can be sensitive. But, I'm just going to, put it out there that I'm not meaning to offend anybody. This is my, journey that I've gone through. I actually grew up in the esoteric, so Christian, very much so, was committed to the church 3 times a week, but it never really truly resonated with me. So as I sought out to find more truth within the journey, I began to move more into the esoteric. And now that's where some people will kind of get lost in translation. So to me, when we say, does God exist? I'm looking at it from a quantum physics standpoint. It's no longer about just a human man that poses as God. It is more so energy and the laws of the universe and science itself, its consciousness. That is more so the energy of God to me. And just the human version of God that we so know in these paintings and throughout history. That's more so that we can relate to something as human beings, right? So it makes it easier for us. However, there are so many holes in that. And again, I'm not meaning to offend anybody. I grew up Christian. So, first of all, if it's based in the Middle East, there's no way that God should have been a white man with blue eyes. Like, it should not have been depicted that way. It should have been depicted more so close to, the culture within that area at the time. And then also, if we look back in history, basically Christianity took from ancient Egypt and Sumerian beliefs and practices, just switching up certain titles and names and stories to make it more so that version. And then they took it to the West and colonized the indigenous to switch them over from spirituality to organized religion. So now, knowing that, I cannot, as somebody who grew up in Canada, I'm not American, so I'm not talking about any sort of like ideology here in terms of politics. I don't really know. But as somebody who grew up in Canada, my province was actually the first to be discovered where a lot of children died from these residential schools, where Catholics pretty much stole them from their families, murdered them, and so on, right? So that really hit home for me, because I have friends who are Indigenous who have had cousins missing and things like that and never resolved. And I just cannot.
Yeah, and there are analogs to that
Mhm.
in America as well.
Exactly.
There was I think the Pope recently apologized for that. Apology in the sense of saying I'm sorry over this past summer. So at least there's been a recognition of that practice.
Absolutely. And I think as more time goes on, we should take a look at the Indigenous and what they had to go through and really truly honor them. I don't think an apology is enough. Like, we need to do more as a community, as a society, to really make that right. And I don't think we ever can fully. It's just so horrendous if we look back in history. So as somebody who grew up Christian and I discovered all of this throughout history and time, I couldn't, it was like a battle within myself, like a dilemma. Like, how can I say I truly believe this and I'm committed to this when there was so much done in history to wrong groups of people through the name of organized religion, right? And so what we have to realize is what people call new age or woo-woo when it comes to the esoteric. It's not new age, it's ancient practices that are now being awakened through people when they're really tapping into their level of consciousness that they are. And these are just, spiritual practices that have been existing throughout time before organized religion ever even existed. So that's kind of like, there's a battle there in terms of more of an ego sense within society. Like, no, I'm right. No, my religion is right. This is not about who's right or wrong. This is about where you are at in your own personal journey. If you resonate with what I'm saying right now, that's your truth. If not, that's okay. But just know that organized religion did come into play and did take away from people, and did, especially with people of color, they've taken away our history and made us believe into something that's more organized so that we are not in touch with our roots.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the message of Jesus, as we know it through the Gospels, resonates with the general sentiment that you're expressing?
Absolutely.
Do you think Jesus himself would, who was, what was Jesus a Christian? I guess on some level, like he was a rabbi and a teacher and itinerant person. He understood himself as a Jew, certainly. But do you think that he would? But he also raged against the Pharisees, as we know, and kind of organized religion. Do you think Jesus would, as we know him through the Gospels, would resonate with what you're saying? Do you think that he was bringing a message of, recognition and understanding of all peoples and maybe peoples of color in particular?
Absolutely. When Yeshua,
Right.
which is Jesus, walked this planet, there were no churches under his name. He was actually teaching everybody enlightenment and going deeper within the self and helping others heal themselves, through physical ailments and things. So it's really the message of love and higher consciousness being the highest elevated version of the self, so that we as a people can come together without being so divided. That was his message. And then after he passed, that's when all the churches were built under his name, quote unquote, right? But It's absolutely the same thing. When we take away the labels, the message of love and truth and really existing as your highest self is the main thing. And that's throughout all religions. You know, that's pretty much what it is. So this is not a journey about who's right or wrong. And I never ever want to make it about that, because there has been so many fights throughout history when it comes to that. It's more so what truly resonates with you. What are you passionate about? Where do you stand in terms of finding your highest self? Go with that. And that's okay. We can all exist and coexist, right? But it is absolutely the same thing. He was teaching enlightenment, and the second coming, quote unquote, to me, is not about a physical man coming down from heaven to show us the way. It is about us awakening to our higher consciousness within ourselves as human beings. And that's where we bring Christ consciousness onto the planet.
I thank you for your comments, and I appreciate them.
Thank
All
you for
right.
having me.
Xbox wants to respond to this. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad that you played good cop in that conversation, because I'm going to go off. Yeah, I think this is a good example of modern post-Christian New Age religion that's likely to become the dominant religion in the Western world, at least among young left-leaning people. I don't think it has much to do with historical Christianity. The idea, for example, that each of us is to speak our own truth. Like Christ says that he alone is the truth, that nobody comes to the Father except through him. Christianity has historically like a very exclusive message of salvation and of the nature of the truth. Now, to be clear, just because it may have been misleading from what I said earlier about the nature of God being kind of a principle of intelligibility or principle of objectivity, that's not a denial of a personal God. So I think Christians, myself included, are absolutely obliged to believe that this ultimate principle of objectivity or principle of reality is a personal God, in fact, a tripersonal God. The interesting theological question is kind of what the character of this fundamental principle of being involves. And I think that it is thought thinking itself, and that if you consider the nature of what thought thinking itself involves, the self-contemplation of God is the Trinity. I mean, whether or not Christianity, I guess, took from prior traditions, I mean, I think that certain aspects of supernatural religion are anticipated by prior religions because they grasp fundamental truths of the human condition that people are inclined to mythologically anticipate. So, for example, like Virgil's Eclogue 4 was generally interpreted as like an anticipation of the birth of Christ in the Byzantine Empire, for example. Yeah, I mean, I don't regret the conversion of native Europeans to Christianity, or the conversion of the New World to Christianity. And I also think that the Canada stuff about colonial schools is just like anti-Catholic blood libel. I think that the allegation of the Catholic Church was complicit in some kind of genocide in Canada, mass killings or whatever, is just straight up blood libel against Catholics.
So are you sorry, are you saying that
agree.
that's a lie? Like, are you saying that what happened to the Indigenous is a
Yes,
lie?
I'm saying that there were no mass graves on Catholic schools in Canada.
No, they weren't mass graves.
No bodies have been found.
Yeah, right, exactly. But there are still Indigenous that have said, and throughout history, that they have been in these residential schools, that their families have been torn apart, and that people have gone missing. So I'm not going to ever disregard their story, even if we haven't found physical proof. There is still proof that there were millions of Indigenous in Canada, and then it trickled down to 2 million, something like 50 million indigenous to 2 million, and in a very short span of time. So we cannot deny their story. And even if it's propaganda in your eyes, I'm never ever going to disregard that, right? Like, it's so disrespectful to them, and I would never. But, like I said, I'm not here to debate this or argue this. This is just my journey, and this is yours, and that's okay. I'm not saying anybody is wrong. It's more so about the truth that each of us align with as individuals. And again, to me, this is a consciousness. This isn't about physicality, because if we're talking about God, then that's source, the universe, that's energy, that's higher than just the physical. And I don't believe that it can just be, put in a box as to, oh, God is a man. It's an energy, whether it's man or woman. And we also have to consider that the church in itself has pushed a lot of misogynistic agenda towards the collective in general, towards society. So until that's equal, until we honor women in churches, then maybe I can support it again more. But till this day, there are women who are not allowed to be preachers in certain churches. And I don't think that's right.
They shouldn't be allowed. When it comes,
Sorry,
you might say
you're
that you want
saying
to
they
speak your
shouldn't be
truth or
allowed.
something.
You're saying women should not be allowed to preach in churches.
Absolutely.
And why is that?
Also, when you say that it's just about speaking your own truth or whatever, and it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, when it comes to theology, and especially now when it comes to an allegation of a crime, blood libel, that Catholics killed, what you're claiming, 48 million American Indians in Canada in the span of a short span of time, 100 years. I mean, what you actually mean when you cite that statistic is that millions of North American natives died as a result of disease and famine. Not that the
Yes.
Catholic Church had 48 million people
No.
in
I
their
never claimed
schools
that.
that they wiped
I never
out.
claimed that. I never claimed that.
So the imputation of genocide to the Catholic Church in Canada is completely undeserved. I think it's a calumny and a libel. So the truth of the matter actually does matter. And also, no, women should not be preachers.
Why is that? Why do you believe that women should not be preachers? I'm interested to know.
That would be, I mean, if Rich is fine with it, I guess we have other questions, but I can discuss
Well,
it.
that was the
It has to
position
do-
of Paul. We
Yeah, Paul.
Episcopalians take the Bible rather lightly, even though we are Protestants of some kind. But go on. Yeah, you can talk about that.
Yeah, so Paul, in the Pauline epistles, Paul does say that women should not be allowed to preach in church. But the more central reason is that the task of preaching falls to the priest. And the priest in the Catholic Mass acts in the person of Christ to represent the sacrifice of the crucifixion. And Christ was a man. I mean, you don't believe that God was a man, but we do. And it's meaningful that the priest who acts in the place of Christ is also a man. And that's always been the tradition of the church. It's always been our law. And it's been taught infallibly.
Okay,
So
thank you.
it's important for the perspective of our sacramental theology that the priest has to be a man. Now, like, women can study theology and talk about it. Catholics have had like nuns do that over the course of our history, but they don't have the role of preaching in a church.
Okay, thank you for explaining from that viewpoint. And what I will leave this space with too is that we have to consider that Mary Magdalene was actually one of the top disciples of Yeshua, and he appeared to her 3 days after his resurrection, or when he passed during his resurrection. She was the first one that he ever appeared to, and yet she is not honored in the Bible. There is a misogynistic, intention in the church, and we have to take a look at that. If we want it to be equal in society, then we must revise this, because if she was the first disciple to ever see him after the resurrection, that should be something that's a big deal, and it's not. Rather, she is called a prostitute, or talked down upon in churches. So that's just something I want to leave the space with. It's all about equality to me. I don't believe that having a man or having the Bible be more represented by men is essentially fair to our evolution as humanity.
Thank you, Nora. I appreciate your comments, and you're always welcome here.
I appreciate y'all. Thank you so much.
We were talking about the Great Schism of 1,000 years ago, and I think a lot, when we're viewing history from our perspective, theological history, sometimes we find these, the Philoque question to be arcane and almost to the point of meaninglessness. I think there is a kind of generic Christianity that has triumphed to a great extent. Catholics don't ultimately believe that a Protestant can be saved. I mean, there's salvation through the church, unless perhaps if you want to disagree with that, you can. But I think there's a light touch given to that, and I think generic Christianity, at least among the hoi polloi, is what has predominated. But don't you think that the dispute over the Eucharist actually is significant and does demonstrate a profound difference between Protestants and Catholics, in the sense of, the Pope is alter Christus. He is you could say a representation or alternative Christ, alt Christ, as it were. and that in believing that the blood of Christ and his body are actually the bread and wine in the Eucharist, that you're in a way re-sacrificing Jesus again and again every Sunday, not letting him rest. And don't you think that is a profound distinction? There was a poll that I saw recently of 70% of Catholics actually believe that the bread and wine are metaphors, that they don't understand that crucial distinction, that they are kind of effectively Protestants. But obviously in Catholic theology and practical, the practicality of the Mass, that is a kind of rehearsed or reiterated sacrifice of Jesus. Don't you think that is a profound distinction? And what do you make of that?
Yeah, you hit upon like my favorite topic. I think it is the central distinction between Catholics and Protestants. Now, Protestants historically, not all of them have denied the real presence of God, Christ in the Eucharist. So I think like Martin Luther certainly affirms it. I think Zwingli says that Christ is only spiritually present. But Protestants have had differing views on this. But what they've generally united on, with I think the exception of some Anglicans perhaps, is that when the Eucharist is presented in the church service, which they won't call Mass, when it's presented in the course of the service, whether or not Christ is there metaphorically or spiritually or truly substantially, like Catholics believe, it's not a propitiatory sacrifice. So it can be a meal of remembrance. I think that's Zwingli's view. It can be offered for the spiritual health of the believers. It strengthens their faith. It's offered for the sake of their communion with Christ. That's why it's called communion. Or it might be a sacrifice and gift of thanks. I think that's a very common Lutheran view. But generally, the Protestants have been united in saying, well, Christ died on Calvary for our sins. That was a once and for all sacrifice to atone for the sin of man. And that is sufficient for your salvation. You're saved by faith in that sacrifice that unites you to the suffering of Christ. And Catholics think that your salvation is not only through Christ's atonement on the cross, but this constant representation of that genuine propitiatory sacrifice, atoning sacrifice in the Mass. That's why they think we believe in salvation through works, and the view that the Mass is a kind of Pelagian sacrilege. And I think that is like the central distinction between Catholics and Protestants, that most things flow from that distinction. The centrality of having a sacrificial religion. I think that's part of why Protestantism is more modern. That I recommended earlier to irreligious people interested in Christianity. I think actually a great work is Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, because in that work I think he begins with Parmenides, but he talks about how ancient religion and ancient philosophy, which is obviously bound up with theology, they all conceived of the world as somehow, or at least Parmenides, I should say, conceived of the world as fallen from this primordial oneness. There's the path of truth, which is being itself, kind of static monism, and then there's the reality of a world in flux. And the world in flux, having fallen from the unity of being, is condemned to pay a price for its existence, and which is becoming, suffering, corruption. Heraclitus thinks that we're kind of able to, instead of recovering this primordial static oneness, we're able to kind of see a musical harmony among flux, which is why Nietzsche is more sympathetic to Heraclitus. But ancient religion is sacrificial because it has this view that the fallenness of the world requires a kind of debt to be paid. Now, Christianity is a different view of what that fallenness consists in, not just mere becoming, but having corrupted self through sin. But that's kind of the sacrificial core of Christianity that it shares with ancient Near Eastern religions and Greek theology. And Protestantism, although it preserves the sacrifice of Christ, it's not as important for Protestant ritual practice. They're not sacrificial religions. I think that's part of the reason why when Kant and kind of moralistic religion comes upon the scene in the 19th century, the conception of the role of the Protestant minister is very different than the priest. They
Mhm.
criticize Catholics for having a sacerdotal priesthood, where the religious ritual practice involves someone who, on the behalf of the community, undertakes a ritual sacrifice. And in this case, it's the bloodless sacrifice of the Mass, of the Eucharist. So in the Protestant religions, where you don't have a propitiatory sacrifice, the primary purpose of the minister becomes anthropocentric. It involves not presenting this propitiatory sacrifice to God on behalf of the congregation, but instead the minister is something like a lecturer who communicates moral truths from the reading of Scripture.
Yes.
So I think that that's kind of like the fundamental difference that most other theological differences kind of flow out of. And also this is like more niche, but that's like part of my criticisms of kind of certain liturgical reforms in the Catholic post-Vatican II liturgical crisis. I think that like Catholics in the West are heavily Protestantized because modern Western culture is intellectually post-Protestant, I guess you'd say. So it makes sense to me that the vast majority of Catholics do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They don't believe in transubstantiation. They don't think the Mass is a sacrifice, and so on. So yeah.
Yes. But the sacrifice was done, and to repeat it endlessly, I don't know. Look, you could call me a dyed-in-the-wool Protestant or a post-Protestant, but I resonate with the Protestant take on these matters. Additionally, there's a kind of Hegelian viewpoint of, who is the Messiah? There's a number of different prophecies of who he's going to be, and there is in Daniel a Christ-like Messiah, a suffering Messiah who's rejected by his own community, and so on. There's a prophecy in Isaiah that of a child with the animals and so on, a pacific vision. There's also a notion of a Messiah as a David-like figure, as a warrior and conqueror. I think that is the message really in the Gospels with Barabbas. Effectively, he is imprisoned for insurrection, and the Jews say, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. His name is actually Jesus Barabbas, so it goes even further of a kind of doppelganger quality with Christ. But Christ obviously is different. He is not an insurrectionist. He's not David in the sense of a warrior king. He is closer to a vision in Isaiah or Daniel. And when he fails, when God is dead, there's a Lutheran hymn of there's God dying on the cross, life and death were in battle. I can't remember exactly, but that God is dead notion certainly predates Nietzsche, and there is a Lutheran quality to it. When he dies, the sacrifice has been made, but also there's an impulse for us to understand the Holy Spirit and be captured by it and to do good in the world. And this, again, endless rehearsal of the sacrificial act, I think, forecloses all of those understandings of Jesus' sacrifice. What think you?
Yeah, I think that's interesting that this might be like a kind of psychological difference between Protestant and Catholic views of the purpose of the atonement, and also like the purpose of salvation. That it seems like on this kind of Protestant view, human beings are burdened by this debt of sin, and Christ releases us from this debt through the atoning sacrifice on the cross. And now human beings enjoy a new kind of freedom in the world.
Yeah.
I don't mean that to have like political connotations, but just like human beings have a new kind of like freedom from the debt of sin, from death, and also from guilt. And now is the age of the kingdom of the Spirit, where human beings can kind of order themselves in accordance with a moral vision that's been renewed from concupiscence or temptation, or the consequences of sin. And the Catholic view, Christ's wounds are not healed when he returns from the dead. Christ still bears those wounds. And what salvation involves is kind of a participation in the life of Christ. And like the atoning, the propitiatory atonement or propitiatory sacrifice of the Mass involves a kind of constant participation in the suffering of Christ himself, by which you are redeemed. And like the ultimate redemption is something that's yet to come. It's been purchased already by Christ's death, but we're still suffering some of the debts of sin. Like we're still dying, right? Which without original sin, human beings wouldn't die in Catholic theology. So we still anticipate the resurrection and final judgment.
Well, you're still suffering after death, Xbox, with this heretical notion of purgatory you guys are so hung up on.
That's true. But if that other guy was right, we're living in the end times and we die in the apocalypse, there's no purgatory for us. So, we got a cheat code. But yeah, I think it's a slightly different vision. I mean, part of this, I think, is the Catholic vision of salvation. Eastern Orthodox people love to talk about theosis. Catholics also share a notion of theosis, meaning becoming God. Now, the vision of salvation is not that, like, well, Christ dies for your sins, and then you get to hang out in, Platonic heaven, and you don't suffer anymore, and it's just like you're basically on vacation forever. Instead, the view is, you kind of you have this Platonic aspiration to union with the good, with God, and that union involves seeing God's essence directly, kind of attaining a kind of potential omniscience. Participation in the inner life of God. Catholics, the term that they use is the beatific vision. Now, it's a very complicated doctrine that involves a certain epistemology of what it means to know something, but the Catholic view of salvation is not like, I should say the Catholic view of justification is not like a once and for all event where, like, Protestants oftentimes, low church Protestants especially, will say, like, when were you saved? Well, there was a moment in which you accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior. On the Catholic view, by contrast, salvation is something that occurs over the entire course of your life by a kind of growing participation in the life of God, which involves a participation in the very suffering of God by meditation on his death. And I think that's part of the Mass, is the Mass involves you progressively over time through repeated liturgy, encountering Christ's atonement and uniting yourself to that atoning sacrifice, instead of just kind of intellectually accepting, like, well, that happened and now it's done.
Yes.
It's a very different.
No, I've seen. No, this is very interesting to me. I've seen some very radical Protestants. I'm thinking of one in particular who has a bit of a YouTube presence, but he was doing proselytizing on the street, and this was about 7 years ago or so, and he was in Pennsylvania, and you might remember this case of I believe his name's Jerry Sadusky, who was a vile child abuser who was working for Penn State football, and it was this huge scandal. And this man, who I appreciate his sincerity, he said, it's not just about good people going to heaven. I want Jerry Sadusky to be saved. And went over a bit like a lead balloon, as you might imagine. But it was, I mean, from his standpoint, we're all Jerry Sadusky. We're all Hitler. We are all in need of redemption in a way to the same extent. Now, this guy obviously is not endorsing any of this, or doesn't think that distinction should be made between a child abuser and a, dutiful husband or something. But his point is, well taken, and it's actually a radical Protestant standpoint. There is no work that could atone for your eternal sin, and it's a powerful vision. I mean, you could see it as almost leading to a kind of nihilism. There's almost like the Tom Sawyer cheat code of, I'm going to be bad throughout my life and then repent on my deathbed and kind of get it all. I think it could lead to something like that. But at the very least, it is a radical and really powerful vision of Christianity.
Yeah, we need a priest for confession in order to use that cheat code. So you're bad week to week, and then you go to confession. I do think that one possible difference that you hinted at with purgatory is also, like, human suffering itself has not a redemptive quality, but it can be united with the suffering of Christ. So, like, part of divine justice and the Catholic view does involve that even the saved have to suffer for their sins. Even the saints do. Because the purpose of purgatory is not just, many Catholic apologists today will emphasize, well, purgatory involves purging our residual attachments to sinful worldly pleasures and kind of preparing us for union with God. But purgatory also involves, in the very same kind of purging, an atonement for your sins, that you still have to pay the piper for every crime that you've ever committed. And according to Aquinas, at least, and many Catholic theologians, the very same fires of hell are the fires of purgatory, which are supposedly, the most painful. It involves the greatest possible pain one could imagine. So Aquinas says it's the greatest physical and spiritual pains of human beings are the sufferings of hell and the redemptive suffering of purgatory. And that's absent from the Protestant account. The Protestant account, generally, if you're elect, you go to heaven, or when you die, you're in soul sleep. That's like Luther's position, until the second coming, and then you're in heaven. There's no additional price to be paid on behalf of divine justice. With the Catholic view, there's like ritualistic significance to human suffering that's absent in the Protestant view.
Well, I have some Catholic relatives. Is there any way that I could, I don't know, pay you to lighten their burden in purgatory? Or?
You can, yes. So indulgences still exist. You still can practice them. So yeah, I mean, part of it is like even worldly works can reduce. They can be part of your the temporal punishment that's due to sin is going to be paid either in the afterlife or in this life. And things that you do in this life can partly atone and reduce your time in purgatory. And since you have a potentially indefinitely long time in purgatory and a finite amount of time in this life, deeds that you do in this life will, they'll be more valuable. So if you fast for a year, that might be 10 years in purgatory or something like that. So there's a very funny scene in The Sopranos where Paulie is talking about how he's come up with the system where if he donates, however much money to the church, he thinks that's like 6,000 years off purgatory. And in one episode, he thinks he goes to a psychic and he thinks he's being haunted by people that he's killed. And he goes to the priest at his local church. And he says, "What the hell? I bought you an organ last year. I thought I was protected from this." The priest says, "Paulie, that's not how it works." But a little bit of a misunderstanding of how it works. But there is an important view of human works as playing a role in salvation, not as what justifies you and makes you elect, but as having an important role.
Yes. All right. I have not gotten to everyone because we have dilated quite a bit on every question. So I am going to apologize to everyone who requested to speak, but I do think we have to end this somewhere, and we could go on for a number of hours. And I have a little bit of work to do before I go to bed. So I'm going to keep this at about 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think that's a good time. Anyway, some really great questions, and I appreciate the fact that everyone listened in, and yeah, I'm glad we did this. We covered quite a bit of ground. So thank you, Xbox.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, guys. I will do this again, of course, and I do have conversations, not quite like this, but some good conversations on my Substack if you guys are interested. So Xbox, where they always do this on podcasts, where can we find you? I guess the answer is your Twitter account.
It's really just here. So if this gets banned, then it's over. Yeah, just follow me here. And always down to chat again, Richard. It was a good conversation.
That sounds good. I would love to as well. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening in, and I will talk to you later. Ciao.